Hi everyone. So you've done your double time writing, and this video will help you get the same information or similar information as those who were present for the workshop that we did on these prompts. So the first thing I always ask the class is, how did it go trying to budget your time? This is the first time we've done 2 essays back to back. That can feel like a lot, and sometimes the time management piece is one of the hardest things. So just kind of reflect for a minute and try to remember whether you were able to finish both essays, what strategies did you use that helped you monitor your time, and are there things you would do differently next time? So then you'll take out the worksheet that says workshop and see if you can use the prompts to complete the blanks. What we always do is try to identify what are the tasks that were given to you in the prompt. And I've provided the right number of spaces so that you can just put in a letter for each space and press pause while you fill that in. Okay, so now you're ready to check your answers. And here is what you should have filled in. So for the first prompt, the first thing you want to be looking for when you're reading The Century Quilt is to analyze the complex meanings that the speaker attributes to the century quilt. And I like to include that one first because you can then focus all your attention when you're reading the poem on how does this speaker or narrator feel about the century quilt, and how can I look for contradictions within their understanding of the quilt. Second task is to analyze how Waniak, the author, employs literary techniques to develop these complex meanings. So they listed structure, imagery, and tone in the prompt, but you could actually analyze others if you wanted. The last task is an unwritten task that you do want to touch on, if nowhere else than in your conclusion. Remember that with question 1 and question 2, which is the 2 types you did, theme is not as crucial as it is with question 3. You do want to focus the majority of your attention in the essay to these prompt tasks because they're the ones that are written out, and you can save theme for your conclusion if you'd like. So when we go back to the prompts themselves, when we talked about this in the class, we noticed that with this poem, there are actually multiple blankets being described, and that created confusion for some students. So we have the blanket that belongs to Mima, and that's the Indian blanket. There's the blanket that is contrasted with Mima's Indian blanket, and that's the one that the speaker says she slept under, that was issued to her family by the army. And then there seems to be this other blanket, which is a quilt that is the focus of the majority of the rest of the poem, and that is what is referred to in the title as the century quilt. So even just the fact that blankets are being depicted in 3 different ways, that could tie into the complexity of her feelings towards the quilt, because the quilt is in some ways similar to these previous blankets and in other ways quite different. So when we talked about the second prompt, the tasks for that one were to analyze the relationship between Ludi Johnson and the urban setting. So something to keep in mind with relationship, that word relationship means you're looking for the types of feelings that Ludi Johnson has towards the urban setting, the ways that Ludi Johnson interacts or reacts to the urban setting. So making sure that you're really getting into the relationship. And then second task is, how does Petrie, the author, use literary devices to reveal this? And they listed imagery, personification, selection of detail, and figurative language as some possibilities. And then lastly, just like the other one, you can touch on theme in your conclusion, and that's really sufficient. It's not wrong to include theme in your thesis, but if you're short on time, saving it for your conclusion is okay. So we've got that prompt, which is here. And the main things we discussed about this prompt were the ways that Ludi Johnson is only first mentioned here, which is pretty far into the passage for it to come up, if that's what we're supposed to be analyzing. So something to keep in mind is that even though she's not mentioned until there, the description of the city before that could still relate to how she relates to the city. So what I'll share with you next is going back to the Century Quilt, what the chief scorer's report said about this prompt. One sec. So they basically said the intent of this question was to read carefully, analyze it, etc. And some of the points that the scorers said that they were hoping students would find was that the speaker's identity is shaped and expressed in a family of multiple colors, the power of the past, of imagination, and of dreams to create the future, and the links among generations. So I don't think they're saying that you needed to touch on every one of those ideas, but that those are some of the ideas that came across in the stronger essays. And then the most important thing they were hoping students would do was make connections between a technique that the writer was using and what the poem meant. The other thing I like to highlight to students is making comparisons between the three blankets. Was another thing that the stronger essays did, and the way that the two previous blankets are informing our understanding of the Century Quilt. And then lastly, another thing I'd like to point out to you all is it says that essays that earned scores in the lower half of the score range tended to avoid the complexity of the poem, understanding its theme on a simply positive register as an expression of childhood happiness. So when you look at the poem itself, yes, there's some positive associated with the quilt, but there's also a little bit of tension as well. So maybe what I'll do at this point is walk through the poem a bit as far as what we discussed all together in class. We mentioned Mima, who most of us agreed was probably the grandmother of the speaker. So there's Mima's Indian blanket, and then there's the army green blanket that the speaker and her sister slept under. And Mima comes to live with the speaker's family, and she brings her medicine, her cane, and that Indian blanket. And the speaker really has positive memories of wrapping herself in that Indian blanket, pretending to be chieftains and princesses. And so that blanket is really associated with magic and fantasy. And then in the next stanza, she shifts to a different blanket. It's now I've found a quilt I'd like to die under. 6 Van Dyke brown squares, 2 white ones, and 1 square, the yellow brown of Mama's cheeks. So we may not know at this point in the poem why Mama's cheeks are yellow brown, but later in the poem when it mentions the fact that the speaker's grandmother's family has multiple races in it, that becomes more clear. The speaker is talking about how this quilt that she imagines is a quilt that she could feel peaceful dying under. And there is a recurring mention of death, but not necessarily in a bleak way, more in a peaceful way. And I think that relates to the fact that this quilt that she imagines is kind of a jumping off point, an entry point into thinking about the generations that came before her. So when we think about ancestors who come before us, many of them are no longer with us. And yet I think the quilt helps her to feel that they are still with her in a way. And some of the characters that come up are Mima, and how Mima, under her blanket, which is the Indian blanket, dreamed that she was a girl again in Kentucky, and that she remembers the positive things about being a child in Kentucky and playing with her sisters and dancing, but then also this line about the racial tensions in the family. So their grandfather's white family nodding at them when they met. We're supposed to infer that the white side of the family was not very approving of the non-white side. And I think we can infer that the non-white side may have been Native American based on this word Indian. So then it talks about the grandmother. She must have dreamed about Mama, and the Mama is the speaker's mama, but Mima's daughter. And so this is the grandmother then using her blanket to travel through time. So there's a little bit of time travel and sort of being able to look into the future at your children, sometimes into the past to look at ancestors' stories. So it talks about the mother's experience in Oklahoma. And then by the end of the poem, it gets a little more personal. So the speaker says, I dream of myself, of my childhood of miracles, of my father's burnt umber pride, my mother's ochre gentleness. Within the dream of myself, perhaps I'd meet my son or my other child, as yet unconceived. So this child, the other child, is not yet born and is not even conceived, and yet the quilt makes her feel connected to these future family members. And then earlier in the poem, it had talked about the sweet gum leaf. And I think you could take this to mean a few things. I envision it as kind of one of the patterns that's on the fabric. And so it's this leaf that shows up throughout the quilt itself. And at the end of the poem, she says, I'd call it the century quilt after its pattern of leaves. And so there are these leaves all over the quilt, but by using the word leaves, I do think it's possible to think about the many meanings of this word. There's a connotation of the family tree that has been discussed in the poem, and, a family tree would have leaves. And then, of course, there's the verb leaves. And so you have the fact that when people pass away, they leave you, and yet this quilt maybe allows us, or the speaker at least, to reflect on those people who came before us and maybe those people who will come after us. So it's a really beautiful poem. There's a lot in it, and these were just the things I picked up on. You may have noticed other things. And what we did next in our class discussion is we went back to this sheet. Everybody jotted down some notes on what we discussed. Then we did the same thing for Ludi Johnson's passage. With this passage, the big thing to pick up on is that the city is not portrayed as a very friendly place. It's personified so much as this malevolent force that's just making everything really difficult for its inhabitants, including Ludi. It's also portrayed as a very dirty, messy place, where people are kind of fighting their way through wind and trash. And the wind is a omnipresent force throughout. So there are many devices that are in the passage. We have Ludi sort of fighting against the elements here, and she suddenly has the wind sort of blow on her extra strong, and she feels lost, but she's really still trying to read this sign to decide whether it's a place where she could live. And by the end of the passage, she is finally able to read the sign, and we can conclude that she does think it's a reasonable place to live.